This is CCNA1 Chapter 11 Part 2 about keeping your network safe. So it's about network security. There are different types of threats when we look at how to secure our network. There could be, for instance, information theft where they steal our data. It could be data loss or manipulation where they change something. It could be identity theft, and it could be disruption of service or denial of service. So there are different types of threats that we look at. When we look at the physical security, there are also different types of physical threats. For instance, we have the hardware threat itself, where we have, for instance, physical damage to our servers, the routers or switching, or something wrong with the cables or the workstations. We could have environmental threats due to temperature rise or both too hot or too cold. We could have humidity extremes where we have, for instance, floods or something like that. There are the electrical threats where we could have spikes in our voltage. We could have insufficient supply of voltage, for instance, a brownout, or we could have a complete blackout, for instance. And we have maintenance threats, which could be, for instance, that we have poor handling of some electronic components, or we can have lack of spare parts, or poor cabling, or poor labeling. All these are threats that look at the physical setup or our network, for instance. And we need, of course, to be able to handle all of these different types of threats. And there are different ways of doing that. Then we have security vulnerabilities. And we also here divide them into three different types. We have the technological vulnerabilities, we have the configuration vulnerabilities, and the security policy. The first one is, of course, where there are some weaknesses in the technology. For instance, the TCP/IP protocol is from the 70s. So, of course, there are some weaknesses in those protocols in that architecture. We also see a lot of vulnerabilities in our operating system, for instance. Whenever a new type of operating system is launched, there are always a lot of security patches afterwards because they find out that there are different weaknesses in them. Then we have the whole human factor, which we can try to do in our security policy. We can describe how the users should react in different scenarios. And of course, it's always the human factor that's the biggest risk in these setups as well. So we need to describe, and if you don't have a security policy, well then the users don't know how they should behave. So try to make a set of rules of how our users should behave on a network. Then there are, of course, all the usual types of viruses, worms, and Trojans, which are types of threats to our network. The virus is a program that can execute itself and do something that we don't want on a workstation. A Trojan is a tool that looks like something else than what it is and could be just asleep inside our network and then be awakened from the outside and then do something or open a back door, for instance. A worm is almost like a virus, but this is a protocol or a type of program that starts its own life and then starts to copy itself over the network. And of course, there are only one way of avoiding this, and that is to have some kind of antivirus program installed, both on your network, but of course also on your end devices. Then we have the type of attacks that is called reconnaissance attacks, where you actually try to monitor a network from the outside. You can monitor internet queries, you can do a ping sweep, find out which devices that are answering back. You can do a port scan to see which ports are open, and you can generally just do a packet sniffing. So this can be done both from the outside and in, but of course also when you are inside, when you are on a wireless network, you could do a packet sniff to see what else is available and open on the network. So this is of course also something that we need to be aware of, that these programs exist. Then there are access attacks where we can, for instance, just try to brute force a password. If I want to log in using an existing user and password, I can do a brute force on the password to try to figure out what it is. I can also send a Trojan into the network and then try to, for instance, do a keylogger that can monitor and find out what is the password. Or we can do packet sniffers, and if we don't encrypt our data, well, then we will be able to see the password in clear text. Then we have a way of redirecting traffic, which is called port redirection, where you can do a redirect on the router, for instance. So if something comes in on port 22 or something, well, then I can redirect it to my computer on another port so that I can, and this can also be, typically it will be done in a sort of man-in-the-middle attack, because then I can just get it to my computer and then resend it to the destination, and somehow they will not know that I'm in the middle and can, overlook what's going on the network and within the communication between the two devices. Then we have the whole denial of service thing, where you just basically make things stop working. And that typically is a storm of packets sent from one or more host computers to one device, and then at some point it can stop working. Typically is just to make your internet connection go down. It could be a denial of service attack on your firewall to make that go down, or to just a host computer. The whole idea here is just to get things to stop working. So how can we avoid all these attacks? Well, first one, of course, is to back up, to upgrade, to update, and to patch. Make sure that whenever you update your operating system, and make sure that you get all the security patches also, which is of course extremely important on the servers and other networking devices. And of course also make sure that you have the backup if something goes wrong. Then you can also do it by setting up specific authentication and authorization and accounting. In this case, authentication is where you have a username and password and be authenticated either by username or password. It could also be more advanced way of authenticating a users with using scanners, using key cards or whatever. Typically you have a combination if you want to be more secure than just both just a username and password. Then you have authorization. Well, then of course on a network there are some places where not all users have access, so that you need to limit your users so that only have access to what they really need. They should not have access to the operating system or the service operating system files, for instance, because then they might accidentally delete it. So restrict your users so they only have what they need. Then you could set up some kind of an accounting where you log what's going on, so that if a file has been deleted or something that has been changed, well, then you can go in and see all the changes, which could also be useful. Then you have, of course, the more technology things, where you set up a firewall, which is a device that you set up between two different networks. And here you can set up packet filtering, so that it will filter on IP addresses, but it can also filter on application, meaning that it will look at the port numbers and it can filter things from the port numbers. You can also set up some kind of URL filtering, so that you can only allow some types of or some kind of URLs, for instance, or you can ban some URLs. You can make it as a stateful inspection firewall, where you set up a rule that it is okay to have responses to come in from a request that is initiated from the inside of the network. So if I have put up something from the inside on port 77, even though that port is closed, well, then it will allow the answers to come back to that request. Then, of course, it is the whole part of the endpoint security, where you, of course, can have personal firewalls also, but it is also important to set up policies. Tell the users what are they allowed to do, and try to educate them not to click on everything they get on an email, for instance. That is a very important thing. But also have anti-software programs installed on your user computers. You could have some kind of intrusion detections, so that you are sure that even if the users do stupid things, that they will avoid accidentally setting out some kind of bad thing happening on the network. Yeah, so how can we secure our devices? Well, of course, we can set up so that we have username and passwords. If we look at the networking devices, we could, of course, also lock them in, which is a good idea, so that they don't have physical access to them. A lot of things can be avoided if you don't have physical access to your networking devices. Then you can set up what kind of authorization you should have. Are you only allowed to look at things, or can you also change things, for instance? And of course, update every time there are some changes or some new patches. Of course, it's important to choose strong passwords, not weak passwords, because weak password is really, really simple to brute force. For instance, if you put in the password secret or Toyota or whatever. So make the passwords strong. In a router or a switch, you can set up these passwords. We have done that a lot of times, and we can encrypt them, which is of course also a good thing to do. That would make the brute force attacks more difficult, but also it, of course, choose strong passwords. I'm not sure if I agree with the use the banner message, but yeah, you can of course do that. Another thing is when we are going, if you're using the telnet options, telnet is a very weak protocol because it sends everything in clear text. So if I want to be able to connect to a device over the network and make changes to the configuration, it could be a very good idea to use SSH instead. This protocol will then encrypt all the traffic between the different devices. So SSH is a good thing to set up, especially if you want to do it over a large network or a public network. Yeah, and that was it.